Alan Wake 1 is a game that does most things wrong. It's initially pretty compelling, but is bogged down by bland and repetitive combat, some pretty terrible movement, virtually no encounter variety, and several far too drawn-out sequences. But setting aside that unfortunate list, it also did a couple of things right. 2010's Alan Wake introduced us to a peculiar world with deep potential, complex characters, and above all, a game that clearly had a lot of passion behind it. Hidden behind its mediocre gameplay was a thorough story with impossible details and just about every single base covered. Its sheer volume of issues were matched one-to-one by the doors that it opened. It was the perfect starting point. In the time after that, Remedy Entertainment tried a lot of different things, trying to right their wrongs while refining their style of complex cerebral stories. With years of experience now behind them, Remedy decided it was finally time to return to Alan Wake. After all, why release your magnum opus before you're even ready to take it on? Fortunately, Alan Wake 2 is everything the first game was, everything it wasn't, and so much more. Using everything that they learned from the first game, Quantum Break and Control, Remedy has crafted something beautiful here. Alan Wake 2 isn't even one of the most impressive games that came out in 2023, it's one of the most impressive games that's ever come out. This is how Alan Wake 2 reinvented storytelling. A common thing you'll hear out of developers is that they're doing something that hasn't been done before, pushing limits, thinking outside the box. Where most people say it, Remedy Entertainment has actually been delivering on that promise for years. Luckily, all that effort is more clear than ever in Alan Wake 2. There are a lot of words you could use to describe this game. Unique, confusing, compelling, terrifying. Out of all these, the one I've settled on when I talk to people about it is impressive. No matter how you feel about the game, whether you find it fun or it's your type of game or not, there should be one thing that anyone can agree on. There's nothing quite like Alan Wake 2. There's no game that looks like Alan Wake 2, no game that weaves story so well into its gameplay and mechanics, and there's certainly no game that uses the medium this well. Scratch that, there's nothing that uses any medium this well. One of the most interesting things you'll see throughout the game is the use of other art forms. Things like film, music, and, of course, writing. Control added a lot to Remedy's formula, but one of the most important was learning how to make a game feel cinematic. Control messed around a lot with cutscenes consisting of exclusively talking, and they did them very well by trying to make them visually interesting. Between a couple characters, or most often just one, exposition was spilled in the best way possible by simultaneously answering and asking questions. They really like to do this with characters transparently overlaid on top of the environment, usually, pacing or thinking out loud. In many ways, it felt like you were actually interviewing them, trying to piece together their cryptic explanations using your own wit. Alan Wake 2 does this a lot. It was good in Control, and here, it's even better. The deuteragonist of the game is Saga Anderson, an FBI agent working to solve a seemingly unrelated mystery within Bright Falls, Washington. Of course, she gets roped into Wake's own story, literally, but she still has to place certain people and pieces together, which I'll talk about more extensively in a little bit. Given that you are literally playing the detective of the story, this format becomes even more effective. Many of these use actual live-action cutscenes with the actors as the characters to further the immersion. While this isn't necessarily a new concept, I've never seen it done all that well. Their integration to Alan Wake 2, however, is so seamless that I actually wonder how different the game would feel without them. The voice acting is amazing, and the live acting in these sequences is just as good at connecting you to the character, and given the game you're playing, it just works. Many cutscenes are often performed by the actors too, with a physical set and many camera angles to really give the impression that you're watching a well thought out, high budget story, and you are. Despite this being a game, the film techniques employed make many of the live-action sections some of the most engaging moments throughout the entire experience. Like most of the interesting stuff here, this traces all the way back to Alan Wake 1. They do it again in Quantum Break, Control, you get the idea. To top off the cinematic direction are these massive title cards that they use at the beginning of every single chapter. I don't think much needs to be said about them. They instill an immediate feeling of excitement, sometimes anxiety, while also hinting at what the chapter will center around. As you can probably tell already, I really like them, and I think they add a lot of welcome flair. Sticking to the central theme of art, music is also used masterfully at many points throughout. Again, I wouldn't say this is a new idea for Remedy though. For years, they've used music to drive home emotional moments or give new meaning to discoveries, but in Alan Wake 2, it just feels so fresh. One of the best examples of this comes fairly early in the main story. Almost all of Alan's story takes place in this really twisted version of New York City. The greenish-yellow streetlights and uncompromising clutter really feeds into the desolation that Alan, and by proxy, you, feel moving through the space. One of the key levels here is a talk show studio. A moment that really stands out to me is during one of the visits to the studio. One entire chapter of Alan's story is dedicated to this musical bit as you explore. Massive screens of the characters dancing and singing are accompanied by a live performance from the in-universe band Old Gods of Asgard. The song is not only really good, but the lyrics take you bit by bit through information from Alan's past. This is perfect for new players. The whole sequence is so strange and attention-grabbing that whoever's playing will certainly be giving it their full, undivided focus, ensuring that they'll be caught up on any background they may have missed if they didn't play the first game. Simply because of the presentation, this section is just as good for fans who are familiar with the universe. Even though this is information you already know, being brushed up on it in such a ridiculous way while also playing through a new location is just so much more fun than getting an exposition dump from a couple of characters or from documents. It's not even the only time the game does this. As I mentioned before, there's an in-universe band called Old Gods of Asgard that's played by members of actual Finnish rock band Poets of the Fall. In previous iterations, they're not much more than a fun mention. They still had a place in the overall story, but it's nothing like their inclusion in 2. They're not only actually fleshed out characters, but there's an entire chapter dedicated to their story. Apart from their individual chapters, they show up at many points to play music, which is always directly related to what's going on within the story. The way they blend all these different art forms together is always unexpected and somehow fits every single time. The story as a whole has a lot of moments that are even reminiscent of theater productions with their melodramatic portrayals. It uses videography and photography especially as an effective method of both horror and storytelling, but I can't really go into that part a little bit more without discussing in-depth spoilers, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Let's move on to Ludonarrative dissonance. You may be familiar with the bloated term already, but if you're not, it describes when a character does something in gameplay that does not line up with their morals or actions within the canon story. A couple popular examples of this are Uncharted, in which the protagonist kills like 1 million people and it just never gets acknowledged, The Last of Us, where Ellie's presence is just non-existent in combat scenarios, and Resident Evil, where the protagonist will be bit by zombies many times and simply not get infected with the virus. Don't take this out of context though, they're all games that I do love, but they just work as examples here. It's unlikely that ludonarrative dissonance will ruin a game for most people. It might hurt the experience a bit, but what's more important is the inverse, ludonarrative harmony. Just as stupid of a term, ludonarrative harmony is when gameplay and mechanics work with the story to create a more immersive experience that functions on many different levels. Translating story to mechanics is not an easy feat. Some games definitely pull this off better than others. A couple of good examples off the top of my head are Ultra Kill with its healing blood and pretty much the entirety of Outer Wilds. Although I'm not the biggest fan of the original Alan Wake, I think that the way you fight the darkness in that game is a phenomenal example of this. Obviously, you combat darkness with light, that part should be obvious, but making your strongest weapons a flashlight or a flare gun was a deliberate choice to make the gameplay a part of the story. Again, this might seem like an outrageously basic concept, but many games don't do a very good job. Alan Wake 2 is not one of those games though. It not only expands on the mechanics from the first game, but it polishes them and introduces so many new ones that also work within the world. Working from the context of an old game is hard. There were a lot more constraints to the medium back then, and so now Remedy had to work around those constraints to create mechanics that had a place in between all the rules that they've already established. Fortunately, cornering themselves with some of the pre-established rules forced Remedy to get really creative with the new mechanics in 2. We'll start with Alan, since his name is in the title after all. Alan is a writer famous for his mystery thriller novels. I'm not going to go into too excruciating of detail, but at the end of the first game he ends up in a shadow realm simply called the Dark Place trying to save his wife, Alice. Much of his arc in this story revolves around finding a way out of the dark place. Since one of its core features is that it weaves art into reality, his goal is to write a way out. Unfortunately, this isn't nearly as simple as it sounds, since very specific conditions must be met for this to happen, and just about everything is not on his terms. Because of this, you'll spend a lot of your time interacting with the environment in really interesting ways, primarily through writing. Switching over to the writer's room, which is Alan's hub-type area with collectibles and story and whatnot, you'll gradually discover scenes within the area you're currently exploring. By collecting files or listening to conversations, you'll uncover literal plot elements which you can apply to these scenes to alter them accordingly. The first time this happens is one of the coolest and, more importantly, unexpected things that I've seen in a game in a long time. Each plot element amazed me by how distinct they change the scene and the little shock you'll get when they transition, which is usually pretty jarring. They typically lead into more discoveries, which can be used to change up scenes from earlier in the level or even the one you're already standing in. To lesser effect, you also get a lamp shaped like an angel fairly early on. There's story significance to this obviously, but that's not what this is about. With this lamp, you can take and store light from certain sources to deposit inside of inactive light sources to, again, change the environment. This has slightly less interactivity, having only 2 states rather than 5, and yet it still is a more unique inclusion than most games can pull off at all. These two mechanics play off Alan's rules with the writing, and additionally the world's rules concerning light and dark in a very creative way. Moving over to the other 50% of the game, we have Saga Anderson, who has traveled to Bright Falls working on a case revolving around a string of ritualistic killings. I touched on this slightly during Chapter 1, but a lot of her gameplay centers around the detective aspect of her character. Where Alan has the writer's room, Saga has her own area simply titled The Mind Place. Much like Alan's equivalent, in here you can view collectibles, commercials, songs, pages, etc. Also like the writer's room, you can use Saga's caseboard to better understand different cases. As you explore, you'll find characters, locations, events, and more to put onto the caseboard. Doing this will help you quite literally connect the dots of each case to read into certain actions and make discoveries. In a similar fashion, you're also able to profile certain characters that you've encountered throughout the game. Profiling allows you to get inside the head of these characters and make inferences based on information that you already know. This works so well here, especially given that Remedy committed to full survival horror this time around. Exploration is a key aspect to any survival horror game, so while you're scrounging around for resources, you'll come across many things that can be put onto the caseboard. In most games with a character like this, you simply play as a detective, but in Alan Wake 2, you actually are one. Putting things together and actually acting as one is so much more satisfying than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Having defined what makes the two protagonists so varied in gameplay, I think it's time we talk about them. The most important part of immersing a player in a handcrafted universe is world building. This isn't a new concept, and it's not even necessarily unique to Alan Wake 2, but it is done really, really well here. There's been a lot of work put into making this world believable, from TV and radio shows that these characters listen to and you can actually experience yourself, to side characters having their own business commercials you can find playing. The amount of effort here is almost unnecessary. Fictional bands have album release dates, well-documented tours, even well-documented agents. A long-running radio talk show based in Bright Falls and present in the first game has frequent episodes and guests that you can actually go and listen to. Each manuscript page and even weapon upgrade you find is a fully voiced inclusion, which again, they simply didn't need to do, but they did. A lot of people who've played the first game will also be happy to hear about the inclusion of Night Springs, the horror TV series from the first game. Although this rarely has any real impact on any events of the story, you'll often see characters happily discussing the most recent episodes, as it is a very popular thing across the world. There's in-universe media, in-universe stigmas, in-universe inside jokes, celebrities, festivals. It's all things you'll grow very familiar with the more you play. Every area even has its own specific and fleshed out history. There are so many layers stacked on top of each other, and they're all worth looking into, especially if you really want to understand the world. The world building is so good that I can pretty much guarantee you'll pick up on most of the background information even if you're not specifically seeking it out. One of my favorite examples of this is with Control. I really enjoy Control. Like Alan Wake, the game gets a lot more intriguing the more time you take to read through documents and videos and other stuff you can find. Despite liking Control so much, after playing the Alan Wake tie-in DLC, I was a little bit worried. The The DLC itself is fine, but now that the two games were officially in the same universe, I was mostly concerned that was as far as they'd go. In my opinion, simply saying two things share a universe is a waste, and yet many games or shows or movies or whatever do it. They link things together and then they don't do anything with it. At best, this is usually cool to think about for a couple of seconds, but is easily forgettable. At worst, though, this can cheapen a game's world, making it feel like the creators were fishing for nostalgia from an old IP. It's especially a problem in the case of number 2, because it can often lead to the consumer of said media being more invested in what could have been done with the tie-in rather than what is actually being done in the game itself, or, again, show or movie or whatever. With a couple of brief references to the first game throughout Control, I was getting pretty worried that it fits squarely into that second category. The DLC expanded on a character who was somewhat important, but also not really, and especially considering how gimmicky the darkness thing felt in the DLC, I was becoming even more concerned. Luckily, Alan Wake's integration with Control is in no way shoehorned in. Even by the end of Control, the Federal Bureau of Control is largely a mystery to us still. Remedy loves questions without answers, which I think is fine as long as they have their reasons, and they do. The Bureau deals with anomalies and is an anomaly in and of itself. Its headquarters is confusing, its structure makes no sense, and even their very creation has no concrete origin. Of course, this doesn't change in Alan Wake 2. The FBC is still just as mysterious, and before they even show up for real, you can tell that they know much more than you do just by finding their remnants throughout the world. With only a little bit of exploration, it becomes somewhat obvious that they've been set up around Cauldron Lake for quite some time. Taking it one step further, pretty early in Saga's story, you may come across a radio surveillance tower thing with a locked door in the Cauldron Lake area. A bit later in the game, you may hear this tower blaring with red alarm lights going off. The door is now open, there's some documents, and it's pretty clear that whoever was here left in a panic. For me, this was an amazing moment. Having played Control, knowing what I know about the Bureau, they like to put on a front of self-importance and like they have things under, well, control. Haha. My immediate thought was, well, fuck. Because if something had this much of an impact on their usual antics, then it must be pretty bad. It had me excited for whatever I was going to encounter in the future. It was an extremely effective moment, and the best part is that I stumbled across it organically. It's also important to note that it's only this effective because of how detailed and well written the notes concerning the FBC are throughout the world, and of course because of the information conveyed in that game. It had me thinking like an actual inhabitant of the world with things to gain or lose rather than someone just playing the game, which is in no small part due to its writing. Writing is one of, if not the single most important aspect to games centered around a story or characters. Of course, any game will reflect the quality of all of its parts, like Alan Wake 1, but creating a character-driven story is impossible without a team that understands the people they're working with. Again, I know this all sounds like really, really basic shit here, but the amount of games that get this wrong is jaw-dropping. Some, like Heavy Rain for example, just lack any form of logic on a really simple level. Some, like Kingdom Hearts, are extremely incohesive, even between direct sequels and spin-offs. Worst of all, there are games that refuse to stay true to characters with actual decades of established lore, like Halo 5. It's clear that the people who wrote these characters understand them deeply. Even from the very first interaction the game shows us between Saga and her partner Alex, we learn a lot about both of them, from the way they talk to each other to what they tell each other, even down to how they reference each other to close family. Despite learning a lot from Alan and Saga's openings, they continue to expand on them masterfully throughout their game-wide arcs. This game, and without a doubt its characters, are a... Don't worry, I'm almost done, we're in the home stretch here. Disregarding all the gamey stuff in Alan Wake 2, it's pretty obvious this is a labor of love. It's a display of pure ingenuity from Remedy, even more so than their previous titles. You can feel the passion throughout the entire project, in the writing to performances to the sheer commitment to some of gaming's most outlandish mechanics and ideas. It's obvious that the people who made this truly care about it. If anything, it's one of the most complete games that I've ever played. It released with a couple of bugs, but at this point, what doesn't? With games this big, it's nearly impossible to catch all of them. There's no microtransactions, no deceptive marketing, and it's pretty damn long, too. Just look at how any of these developers talk about it, or hell, any of their games. These aren't just a bunch of developers making a game. This really is a team, and they act like it. This may be their job, but they all have a common goal to make this the best game that they possibly can. I mean, come on. Look how much fun they're having up there on stage. I can't even imagine how it feels to know that your creation had such a positive impact that you get to perform one of the songs and dance at the actual Game Awards. It's just really nice to see so many people so passionate about what they made for a change. With today's landscape being dominated by huge budget titles that are basically mass-produced and engineered to sell as many copies as possible, it's refreshing. Not to say this is a low-budget game or anything, but it stands out in the way that it challenges modern tropes by doing quite literally whatever the fuck it wants to. Remedy have been inching towards this for a while. From Alan Wake 1 to Quantum Break into Control, they have progressively made stranger stuff, but even after Control, I think they were still a couple miles away from what they ended up with here. Alan Wake 2 feels like such an explosion of creativity and weirdness that it has me anxiously awaiting some expansion to the world that probably won't be here for quite a long time. I think Remedy has finally broken free. Now they know they can get really crazy with it, and now they know that it can work. If you haven't already, please play Alan Wake 2. It's not a game, it's a masterpiece. I think this is a good time to close the video out. As you can probably tell, the script was a bit messy, so I hope that the final outcome translated okay to video. I can barely even make a coherent 20-minute long video, so I really don't know how those, 4-hour long video essays or more ever get made, or even, hell, an hour. Beyond this, I'm also planning a full story breakdown of all the games, from Alan Wake 1 to American Nightmare to Control to Alan Wake 2. So yeah, hopefully in a more organized way than this video was. Currently, the idea is that this video will come out shortly after this one, probably about a week or so. I'm not sure. I'm starting work on it after I finish this. Unfortunately, nothing ever really goes according to plan with the videos, so we'll see on that. But regardless, I hope you all enjoyed this. For more updates and such, check out my Discord and other media linked in the description. More importantly, it would mean a lot if you liked, commented, or especially subscribed. This video ended up being a lot more ambitious of a project than it started as, so I hope that you liked it. Anyways, you'll probably hear from me again kind of soon. Thank you so much for watching, have a great night, and I'll catch you in the next one.